This is Barry Zalma speaking for Claim School Incorporated's blog, Zalma on Insurance. Today we're going to talk about why one cannot receive indemnity from an insurer for old damage, and that a statute in Minnesota requiring a replacement cost and some code changes will not require an insurer to bring a church property up to code from damage that predated the loss. In St. Matthew's Church of God in Christ versus State Farm Fire and Casualty Company, a November 23, 2022 decision of the Supreme Court of Minnesota, St. Matthew's sought payment for damaged masonry wall when covered peril only damaged drywall covering the masonry that had been cracked as a result of old age. In June of 2017, a storm damaged the property of St. Matthew's, including the building's drywall. State Farm agreed to cover repair costs for the damaged property caused by the storm, including removal and replacement of the damaged drywall. When the damaged drywall was removed, however, cracks in the masonry were discovered. There is no dispute that the cracks in the masonry pre-existed the storm. However, because the cracks in the masonry violated the city's building code, the city of St. Paul would not allow St. Matthew's to replace the drywall without also repairing the masonry. St. Matthew's requested that State Farm reimburse it for the cost of repairing the masonry. At issue was the interpretation and application of Minnesota Statute 65A.10, Subdivision 1, parentheses 2020, referred to as the statute. The statute requires replacement cost insurance to cover the cost of repairing any damaged property in accordance with the minimum code as required by state or local authorities. And in the case of a partial loss, replacement cost insurance is required to cover only the damaged portion of the property. St. Matthew's policy provided replacement cost coverage, meaning that in the event of a loss, the insurer agreed to compensate for the loss without taking into account depreciation. State Farm's typical policy, however, does not require it to cover the cost of bringing property that is lost or damaged up to code. But the policy issued to St. Matthew's included a Minnesota endorsement which states in relevant part, quote, "If this coverage is provided on a replacement cost basis, we will pay the increased cost of replacing, rebuilding, repairing, or demolishing any building in accordance with the minimum code in force at the time of loss as required by state or local authorities when the loss or damage is caused by a covered cause of loss. In case of a partial loss to the covered property, we will pay only for the damaged portion of the property." In December of 2018, State Farm paid St. Matthew's $107,053, an amount that included the cost of replacing and repairing the drywall. St. Matthew's was required to obtain a building permit from the city to make the necessary repairs, including replacing the drywall. The city was concerned about the defects in the existing masonry wall, which rendered the wall out of code. St. Matthew's subsequently requested State Farm to pay the cost of bringing the masonry up to code. In response, State Farm hired a consultant to evaluate the damaged masonry and determine the cause of damage. The consultant concluded that the cracked and out-of-plumb condition was a long-term condition unrelated to the storm. On cross motions for summary judgment, the district court granted summary judgment to State Farm. In reviewing the decisions of the district court and the Court of Appeal thereafter, the Minnesota Supreme Court found that the parties had agreed that the damaged property at issue is a partial loss, and that before the drywall can be repaired, St. Paul City Code required that the masonry be repaired sufficiently to bring it in accordance with minimum code requirements. The statutory language, quote, "In the case of a partial loss, this coverage applies only to the damaged portion of the property," is susceptible of only one reasonable interpretation. In the event of a partial loss, the insurer's obligation is limited to bringing up to code that portion of the property that was damaged. The Supreme Court concluded that the statute means that when a partial loss like St. Matthew's suffered here occurs, State Farm's obligation to bring the damaged portion of the property up to minimum code is limited to repairs necessary to bring up to code that part of the property that was damaged in the insured event. Since it was undisputed that the drywall was damaged in the storm, it was also undisputed that the masonry was damaged earlier as a result of a different, apparently unknown cause. Consequently, State Farm was not required to pay for repairs to bring the masonry up to code under the statute. Contrary to St. Matthew's assertion that the drywall and the masonry are part of a single damaged item, the wall, which includes both the drywall and the masonry, the court found that it was not. All parties agreed that the damage to the masonry was not caused or impacted by the storm. Accordingly, the damage to the masonry was not independently covered by State Farm's policy. Viewing the project from the perspective of a drywall installer, there was nothing in the condition of the masonry that prevented the installation of new drywall. The Supreme Court concluded that under a plain reading of the statute, in the case of a partial loss, replacement cost coverage applies only to the damaged portion of the property covered by a cause of loss. Only the drywall was damaged because of the storm. The masonry was not. Therefore, only the damaged drywall is subject to the statute's code compliance provision. Under the statute, when a partial loss occurs, an insurer's obligation to bring the damaged portion of the property up to a minimum code is limited to repairs necessary to bring up to code only that part of the property that was damaged in the insured event. In my opinion, insurance requires by definition that it respond only to a contingent or unknown event. It cannot and should not respond to damage that preceded the date the policy came into effect, from causes that were not caused by a peril insured against, since the only damage by the storm was to the drywall, and since both parties agreed that the damage to the masonry was not caused by the storm that damaged the drywall. Unfortunately for the church, it did not acquire code compliance coverage, and the statute it relied on was not as broad as the church desired. This is maybe a question of the agent who sold the church the policy, but that was not at issue before the Supreme Court. This video was adapted from my blog, Zalma on Insurance, which is available free to anyone who clicks on the URL zalma.com/blog. If you found this video to be of interest to you, please refer this to your friends and colleagues so that they can also view the video, read the blog post, and subscribe to the blog and to the videos on YouTube and or rumble.com. You might also consider it worthwhile to subscribe to my locals community and my Substack publications. Thank you for your attention.